Thierry Henry has long been regarded as one of the greatest players in the history of world football. For Arsenal FCC fans, he is not just an outstanding striker, but also the symbol of an entire glorious era. Throughout his career at Arsenal, Henry scored 228 goals, becoming the club's all-time top scorer. He helped Arsenal win the Premier League twice, and especially in the historic 2003-2004 season when the team achieved the legendary Invincibles feat, winning the league without losing a single match. Individually, Henry won the Premier League Golden Boot 4 times, was named PFA Player of the Year twice, and FWA Footballer of the Year 3 times. On the international stage, he was a key part of the France team that won the 1998 FIFA World Cup and then went on to triumph at UEFA Euro 2000. When he moved to FC Barcelona, Henry continued to reach the pinnacle by helping the team win the 2009 Champions League as part of their historic treble. Those titles, those goals, and his artistic playing style turned him into a legend, a name that commands respect from millions around the world. But behind that spotlight is a completely different story. Before becoming a legend, Henry was a boy who grew up under the harsh pressure of his father, who always demanded perfection from his son and allowed no room for failure. The fear of disappointing his father turned football for Henry into not just joy, but a battle to prove himself. When he moved to Juventus in the late 1990s, his career nearly collapsed as he was played out of position and mocked by the Italian media. Even after becoming a star at Arsenal, Henry still carried deep emotional scars. The painful defeat in the 2006 UEFA Champions League final, his broken marriage to Claire Mary, and the controversial moment in the 2009 World Cup playoff between France and Ireland that severely damaged his reputation. Those events made Henry understand that glory never comes for free, but it was precisely in those difficult moments that his true resilience emerged. He didn't crumble under criticism or failure. Instead, he kept getting back up, kept playing, and kept proving that the real strength of a legend lies not in the number of goals, but in the ability to overcome pain that few can see. If the story behind Thierry Henry's spotlight makes you reflect, subscribe to the channel right now to join us in exploring the untold chapters in the lives of sports legends. Outside Paris, not far from the dazzling boulevards lit up with lights, there is a gray concrete suburb called Les Ulis. That is not a place where people dream of glory. It is where immigrant families live crammed together in cold high-rise buildings, where children grow up amid cracked concrete pitches and dreams that often fade before they can mature. It was there, in the summer of 1977, that Thierry Henry was born. His family carries Caribbean blood. His father, Antoine Henry, came from Guadeloupe. His mother, Maryse, has Martinique roots. They came to France hoping for a better life, but like many immigrant families, theirs was far from easy. Les Ulis was no paradise for children. But for little Thierry, it was the only world he knew. The gray concrete walls, the small patches of grass between the blocks, and the makeshift pitches became the boy's universe. Football quickly became Thierry's greatest joy. When the ball rolled at his feet, the skinny boy could forget everything around him. But in the small Henry family home, football was not just a game. For Thierry's father, it was the only way for his son to escape a hard life. Antoine Henry was a strict man, so strict that many thought he was almost cold. He was not the type to hug his son often or offer gentle words of encouragement. In his mind, love was not shown through words, but through discipline. And that discipline was sometimes so harsh it left a child trembling. From when Thierry was very young, his father set a clear rule. If his son wanted to play football, he had to become the best. There was no second option. After school, while other kids ran around playing freely, Thierry was often dragged to the pitch for training. The sessions lasted for hours. Antoine stood on the sidelines, watching every run, every touch. If Thierry passed wrong, he would shout. If Thierry lost the ball, he would shake his head in disappointment. Sometimes even a small mistake was enough for the boy to hear scolding all the way home. There were evenings when Thierry returned to the small apartment in silence. He didn't cry, but the fear was always there. The fear of disappointing his father. The fear that if he wasn't good enough, everything would collapse. Neighbors in Les Ulis later recalled that Antoine often stood outside the pitch, watching his son with a stern gaze. Not everyone understood his way of teaching. Some thought he was too harsh, but Antoine believed the outside world was far more cruel. If Thierry didn't learn to handle pressure early, he would never survive in professional football. Thierry was just a child then, but he began to understand something very early. Football was no longer pure joy. It became a responsibility, a duty, a challenge he could not afford to fail. Every time he stepped onto the pitch, Thierry wasn't just playing for himself. He was playing to prove his father was right to believe in him. Those years in Les Ulis gradually turned the shy boy into a determined young player. He ran faster than the other kids. He trained more than his peers, and little by little, Thierry's talent began to shine through. But even as people started noticing his special ability, there was always an indescribable emptiness in Thierry's heart, because no matter how many goals he scored on those small suburban pitches, he always felt he had to do more. Run faster, score more, be more perfect. In Antoine Henry's world, there was no room for weakness, no room for excuses, and certainly no room for failure. Many years later, when Thierry Henry had become one of the greatest players in football history, people often looked back at his childhood and saw an inspiring story, a boy from a poor suburb rising to the top of the world. But few truly understood the cost of that journey, because behind every run Thierry made on the grass were thousands of hours of training under his father's stern gaze. Behind every goal were silent evenings in the small apartment in Les Ulis, where young Thierry lay in bed, wondering if he had done enough. And it was during those years that a lesson became deeply etched into the boy's mind. A lesson not found in books, but one that shaped his entire life afterward. In Thierry Henry's world, failure was not an option. Failure was simply not allowed to happen. That fear of failure did not disappear when Thierry Henry left the concrete pitches of Les Ulis. If anything changed, it was that the pressure only grew bigger. When the talent of the skinny boy with long legs and astonishing speed began to attract scouts' attention, Thierry Henry's life gradually entered a completely new chapter. The small street matches between neighborhoods were no longer enough to contain the ambitions of those who believed this boy could become something much greater. And then the opportunity came. Thierry was invited to join the youth academy of AS Monaco, one of the most prestigious football academies in France at the time. For many teenagers, that would be a dream, but for Thierry, it felt like stepping into a new battlefield. Because from that moment, football was no longer a game. It became a path to survival. Thierry did not play football for joy. He played football because he wanted to escape the poor suburb where he grew up. Les Ulis might be home, but it was also a constant reminder of the limits he did not want to be trapped in forever. The concrete buildings, the gray streets, and the stories of broken dreams made him realize that if he didn't succeed, life could pass in the same quiet exhaustion as those around him. But there was another, deeper reason why Thierry could not allow himself to fail. He wanted to make his father proud. Even though Antoine Henry rarely said it out loud, Thierry always felt the enormous expectations in his father's stern eyes. Every time Thierry stepped onto the pitch, he knew he was not just playing for himself. He was playing for the man who always stood on the sidelines, who had devoted his son's youth to forging him into a warrior. But life at the Monaco Academy was nothing like the dreams people usually imagine. When Thierry arrived there, He was still just a teenager, leaving his family to pursue what thousands of other kids were also chasing. The first days at the academy were long and quiet. No more familiar sound of his mother's voice in the small kitchen in Les Ulis. No more familiar streets where he ran after the ball with friends. Instead, there was the dormitory, shared bedrooms, quick meals, and a grueling training schedule. At Monaco, every young player understood one thing. Not everyone would succeed. In fact, most would fail. And that fear always hung in the air. The competition at the academy was so fierce that sometimes Thierry felt like just a name on a long list of players who could be replaced at any moment. Every training session was like an exam. Every internal match was a chance to prove he deserved to stay. The coaches watched everything: speed, technique, attitude, even how a player reacted after making a mistake. Thierry quickly realized there was no room for weakness here. If you were slower than others, you would be left behind. If you lacked determination, another player would take your spot. And if you weren't strong enough mentally, the door to the dream could slam shut before you even realized what had happened. The nights in the dormitory were often when the loneliness felt most real. When the lights went out and the other young players drifted off to sleep, Thierry sometimes lay staring at the ceiling, thinking about the path he had chosen. He missed his family. He missed the small apartment in Les Ulis. But at the same time, he knew going back was not an option. He had gone too far. And more importantly, he knew his father would never accept it. So every morning when the sun rose, Thierry tied his laces again, stepped onto the training pitch, and ran faster than the day before. He shot harder. He trained more diligently, not because he enjoyed the pressure, but because he had no other choice. Gradually, the coaches at Monaco began to notice that tall, skinny teenager with astonishing speed. They saw what many others hadn't yet realized: a talent being honed by an iron will. But what few understood was that Thierry's true motivation didn't come from a desire for fame or money. It came from fear. The fear of not being good enough. The fear of failure. The fear that if he stopped even for one step, everything would collapse. And it was that very fear that pushed him forward, step by step, through exhausting training sessions, through tense matches, and through the lonely years in the academy. In the eyes of many, Thierry Henry was a natural-born talent. But the truth was far more complicated. Talent could open the door, but it was the fear of failure that forced the boy from Les Ulis to step through that door and keep moving forward, even when the path ahead was full of uncertainty. And when the coaches at Monaco finally decided to give Thierry his first professional playing opportunity, they weren't just giving a chance to a young player. They were giving a chance to a boy who had learned to fight from a very early age, a boy who played football not for entertainment, but to survive. Those years at the Monaco Academy ultimately led Thierry Henry to the moment he had dreamed of since he was a little boy chasing a ball among the concrete buildings of Les Ulis. After years of relentless training, after cold mornings and lonely evenings in the dormitory, the door to professional football finally opened. Thierry Henry made his debut for AS Monaco's first team while still very young. For many players, that was a dream come true. But for Thierry, the feeling was far more complex. He didn't feel like he had won. He only felt that the real battle had just begun. Right from his first matches, Henry's talent began to explode. His astonishing speed, the bursts that left opposing defenders desperate, and his rapidly improving goal-scoring ability quickly made him one of the most talked-about young players in France. The fans at the Stade Louis II started mentioning his name more often. Sports journalists began writing about the tall, skinny teenager with legs like the wind. To the public, Henry seemed like a fairy tale, a boy from a poor suburb rising to the big stage of professional football. But behind the stadium lights, in Thierry's heart, the familiar feeling he had carried since childhood remained. The feeling that he had to prove himself every single day. One good match wasn't enough. One beautiful goal wasn't enough. He always felt he needed to do more, faster, better. In a short time, Henry was no longer just a promising talent. He became one of the most prominent young faces in French football. And then one day, the news that any young player dreams of arrived. Henry was called up to the national team. When he first pulled on the blue shirt of the France national team, he was still a very young man, standing among players who had already become legends. In the locker room, names like Zinedine Zidane and Didier Deschamps were already icons of European football. Henry stood among them, both proud and quietly observing. To the outside world, this was a huge step forward in his career. But inside, Henry still felt like the boy from Les Ulis, trying hard not to let anyone see how anxious he still was. And then 1998 arrived, bringing one of the greatest moments in the history of French sports. France hosted the 1998 FIFA World Cup, and the entire nation lived in an atmosphere of enormous expectation. For Thierry Henry, it was an unimaginable opportunity. He was still very young, yet he was part of the national team at the biggest tournament on the planet. As the tournament began, Henry unexpectedly became one of the most effective attacking players for the France team. He scored crucial goals, showing speed and confidence that made fans start looking at him differently. Suddenly, the boy who once ran on small pitches in Les Ulis was now playing in front of millions of viewers around the world. And then the historic moment arrived, when the final whistle blew at the Stade de France. The France national team became world champions. The whole country erupted in joy. The streets of Paris were filled with celebrating fans. The players became national heroes. Thierry Henry, the young man barely in his 20s, stood among his teammates and lifted the most prestigious trophy in world football. To millions, it was the perfect image of success. A young star had reached the pinnacle of football before many others had even begun their careers. But what no one saw in those celebration photos was the quiet feeling inside Henry. As fireworks lit up the Paris sky and millions chanted the players' names, Thierry stood amid the nation's shared joy. But deep in his mind, a familiar thought persisted, a thought that had followed him from the days in Les Ulis, from the harsh training sessions under his father's gaze, from the lonely nights in the Monaco Academy. He looked around at the legends of French football, at the golden trophy in his hands, and asked himself a question he had never dared to say out loud. I don't belong here. To the world, Thierry Henry was a World Cup champion, a young hero, a talent rising to the top of European football. But to himself, that journey had never felt truly secure, because in the heart of that young man, the fear of failure had never disappeared. And even while standing at the pinnacle of world football, Thierry Henry still felt as though he was only just beginning to step onto the challenging path ahead. But sometimes, football has a cruel way of reminding young players that today's peak can become tomorrow's abyss. After the glory of the 1998 World Championship, Thierry Henry's career seemed to be surging forward at an unstoppable pace. He was still very young, already a World Cup champion, and regarded as one of Europe's brightest attacking talents. So when the opportunity came from Italy, many believed it was just the next step on the path to becoming a global superstar. Henry moved to Juventus, one of Europe's biggest and most storied clubs. In the imagination of many fans, this was where he would continue to develop, keep scoring, and become one of the world's top strikers. But reality turned out to be completely different, and for Henry, his time at Juventus was not the next chapter of glory. It was closer to a nightmare. Right from the first matches, everything started going wrong. At Monaco, and with the France team, Henry usually played in a free attacking role, where his speed and movement could be fully unleashed. But at Juventus, he was pushed out to the wing, a position that didn't suit his instincts. Italian football at the time was famous for its tactical discipline and tight defense. Serie A defenders weren't just strong, they were extremely smart at reading the game. For a young player still trying to define himself, that environment felt like a maze. Henry didn't know how to escape. The bursts of speed that once left French defenders reeling were now often stopped before they could even start. His finishing, once his weapon, became rare, and with each passing match, Henry's confidence gradually faded away bit by bit. In the stands and on the Italian sports pages, patience began to run out. Journalists didn't hesitate to ask, was the boy once praised at the World Cup really that good? Articles started appearing with skeptical tones. Some called him an overhyped talent. Others said he was too fragile to survive in the harsh environment of Serie A. Those criticisms didn't just appear in the press. They echoed from the stands, from football commentary shows, from everywhere Henry could hear. For a young player used to being praised, the change felt like a shock, and for the first time in many years, Thierry Henry began to doubt himself. The training sessions in Turin gradually became heavier. Henry still ran, still practiced, still tried to recapture the touch that had once made him one of Europe's most prominent young players. But in his heart, a question began to emerge. A question he had never allowed himself to think about before. What if everyone was right? What if he really wasn't as good as they once thought? In the quiet nights after disappointing matches, Henry sometimes sat alone and looked back at his journey. From the small pitches in Les Ulis to the World Cup title, everything had happened too fast. And now, as everything began to crumble, he didn't know if he had the strength to rebuild it all. There were moments when Henry wondered if his previous success had just been luck. Were the goals at Monaco, the performances at the World Cup, all just a brief flash before reality exposed the truth? Maybe I was never that good, he thought in his darkest moments. That was the most dangerous thought for any player, because when a player loses faith in himself, everything on the pitch starts to feel heavy. Every touch becomes hesitant, every decision becomes slower, and when confidence disappears, talent gradually gets buried. To the outside world, Thierry Henry was still a World Cup champion, but at Juventus, that title seemed to mean nothing. Italian football didn't care what you had done in the past, it only cared what you could do today, and in those months, Henry seemed unable to prove anything. Playing opportunities dwindled. Skeptical looks grew more frequent, and for the first time since leaving Les Ulis, his career path seemed to be heading toward a dead end. Looking back later, many people say that Henry's time at Juventus was just a short phase in his career. But for him personally, it was the moment when everything seemed to collapse. It was when he stood at a crossroads in life, one path leading to becoming one of the greatest strikers in football history, and the other leading to becoming a talent who once showed promise but never truly reached the top. And in those dark days in Turin, Thierry Henry came very close to losing it all. In those gloomy days in Turin, when the world's faith began to abandon him, and even he himself started doubting himself, there was one man who still quietly followed every step Thierry Henry took. That man didn't see a failed player. He saw a talent being played in the wrong position, and more importantly, he saw a player who still hadn't fully understood his own potential. That man was Arsène Wenger. Before the English football world knew Henry, Wenger had already worked with him at AS Monaco. He understood that the boy from Les Ulis didn't just have speed, but also football intelligence, sharpness in front of goal, and an enduring will forged from years of pressure-filled childhood. When Wenger watched Henry play at Juventus, he didn't see a bad player. He only saw a player being placed in a role that wasn't his. So when the opportunity arose, Wenger acted. In 1999, he brought Henry out of Italy to join Arsenal FC. For many, it was a gamble. Henry had just come off a disappointing period in Serie A. Some English journalists even questioned why Arsenal would spend money on a player that Juventus seemed ready to let go. But Wenger didn't care about the doubts. He believed Henry had never been played in the position that suited his instincts, and he had a clear plan: turn the failed winger from Italy into a central striker. But even Wenger's faith couldn't make everything change overnight. When Henry arrived in London, he stepped into a completely new environment. English football was faster, stronger, and harsher. Premier League defenders didn't give anyone time to adapt. And in his first matches, Henry seemed to still carry the ghosts from Turin. He ran a lot, moved intelligently, but the goals didn't come. Match after match passed, and the name Thierry Henry began appearing in English papers with less than friendly headlines. Some journalists wrote that Arsenal had bought the wrong man. Others said Henry was just a speed player lacking goal-scoring instinct. Some even called him a flop, a failed signing. For a player once praised as a World Cup champion, those comments felt like salt in old wounds. Henry tried not to read the papers, but in that era, it was impossible to completely avoid the criticism. It echoed from football commentary shows, from the stands, and from the skeptical atmosphere surrounding him. Those first weeks at Arsenal became a huge mental challenge for Henry. He had gone through something similar at Juventus, and the memory was still very fresh. Every goalless match felt like a reminder that his career could slip away from him again. Once more, the old question resurfaced in his mind. What if the critics were right? What if he really wasn't good enough to be a striker in Europe's toughest league? But this time, there was one difference compared to his time in Turin. This time, there was Arsène Wenger. While the press questioned Henry, Wenger kept his familiar calm. During training sessions, he talked to Henry a lot. He explained how a central striker should move. He told Henry to trust his instincts. And most importantly, he didn't let outside criticism break the confidence of the young player he believed in. There was one moment after a match where Henry missed a clear chance, and he walked into the locker room looking disappointed. Wenger looked at him and simply said one thing. "I didn't buy you to be a winger. I bought you to be the best striker in Europe." For Henry, those words were both pressure and salvation. Throughout his career, he had been used to people demanding perfection from him. But Wenger was the first to make him believe he could become something bigger than he had ever imagined. However, Wenger's belief still wasn't enough to make goals appear right away. The following matches remained tough. Henry still missed chances, and every time the final whistle blew without him scoring, the anxiety returned. His career once again seemed to hang on a fragile edge. If things didn't change soon, Thierry Henry's story could end like so many other talents, a player who was once highly expected but never truly reached the top. At that point, few could imagine that the guy being called a flop in London would one day become the greatest player in Arsenal's history. But in those difficult months, when goals still hadn't come and doubt still loomed, Thierry Henry knew only one thing. This time, he couldn't let everything collapse again. And somewhere on the sidelines, Arsène Wenger still stood there, calm and patient, like the only man in the football world at that moment who absolutely believed that Thierry Henry's story was far from over. Those weeks full of doubt in London ultimately led Thierry Henry to a decision that he later admitted was one of the most important moments in his life. If the world doubted him, if the press called him a failed signing, then he wouldn't answer with words. He would answer with silence and with the unseen hours of training. And so, when the stadium lights went out and most players had left the training ground, Thierry Henry often stayed behind. He ran extra sprints, practiced finishing hundreds more times, worked on movements in front of goal until his legs could barely feel anything. People who worked at Arsenal FC later recalled that Henry was one of the hardest training players they had ever seen, not because he lacked talent, but because he was afraid of losing it. The pressure had followed Henry from his childhood in Les Ulis, through the years at Monaco, through the nightmare at Juventus, and now at Arsenal, that pressure turned into a massive driving force. Every training session was like a declaration of war against the fear of failure. Henry wanted to prove to everyone that Arsène Wenger had been right to believe in him, but deeper down he wanted to prove it to himself. Then one day, the first goal came. It wasn't a perfect goal, not an artistic moment that made the crowd gasp, but for Henry, it was like a door had just been opened. From that moment, everything started to change. He scored, then he scored again. And then he kept scoring. The bursts of speed that once tormented defenders at Monaco now began appearing in the Premier League. His cold finishes into the far corner gradually became a familiar sight for Arsenal fans. The crowd at Highbury started standing up every time Henry got the ball. They knew something special could happen. A burst of acceleration, a light touch, and the ball nestled in the net. It was football that was both simple and beautiful enough to keep viewers glued. In a very short time, the player once called a flop began to become a nightmare for defensive lines across England. Premier League defenders quickly learned a lesson they wouldn't forget. If you gave Henry even a few meters of space, he could end the match in an instant. His speed left many helpless. But what made Henry truly dangerous wasn't just speed. It was his intelligence in movement. He knew exactly when to burst forward, when to drop back, when to wait, and when the moment came, he rarely missed. Commentators began talking about him with bigger and bigger words. Talent, star, super striker, and then a phrase started appearing in English sports papers, the most feared striker in England. But if you looked inside, Thierry Henry was still not the man the public imagined. To the fans, he was the image of absolute confidence, long strides, cold eyes, proud celebrations. But behind that image was still the boy from Les Ulis, who once feared disappointing his father, who once sat in the Turin locker room wondering if he was really good enough. Success at Arsenal didn't erase that fear. If anything changed, it was that the fear only became more refined. When Henry scored, people praised him, but that also created new pressure. Now he had to keep scoring. With each passing season, expectations for Henry grew bigger. Fans didn't just want him to score. They wanted him to become an icon. They wanted him to lead Arsenal to glory. They wanted him to be the player who made the entire Premier League tremble. And Henry understood that clearly. Every time he stepped onto the Highbury pitch, he could hear tens of thousands chanting his name. For many players, that was glory. For Henry, it was also a burden, because he knew that one day, if he stopped scoring, those chants could vanish as quickly as they had appeared. So even after becoming one of England's most dangerous strikers, Henry continued to train like a young player still trying to prove himself. He didn't allow himself to stop. He didn't allow himself to be satisfied. Every goal was just the next step, not the destination. And it was that attitude that made him more terrifying than ever to opponents. Because when a player is both talented and driven by the fear of failure, they can reach limits that others can't touch. In the eyes of the fans, Thierry Henry was entering the most glorious period of his career. The goals, the spectacular solo runs, the matches where he almost single-handedly changed the outcome, all of it, made him one of the most beloved players in England. But even as the world began to call him a legend, in Henry's mind there still existed a small voice, a voice he had heard since he was a boy in Les Ulis, a voice reminding him that everything could disappear at any moment. And perhaps it was that very voice that made Thierry Henry the player the whole of England feared. But it also made him a man who never fully believed he was good enough. Thierry Henry's goals gradually became a familiar sight across England. At Premier League stadiums everywhere, defenders started learning to drop deeper whenever he got the ball. Coaches devised specific defensive plans just to deal with him, but even when they prepared thoroughly, there were still moments when all of it became meaningless, just a tiny bit of space. One burst of acceleration, and Thierry Henry could turn an entire defense line into helpless spectators. The early years of the 2000s saw Henry step into the most brilliant phase of his career. And then, the 2003-2004 season arrived, bringing with it a story that would later be known by an almost mythical name, the Arsenal Invincibles. It wasn't just a successful season, it was an almost unbelievable one. Under Arsène Wenger's guidance, Arsenal FC entered the Premier League campaign with near-bold confidence. They could beat anyone, but even the most optimistic couldn't have imagined what was about to happen. Match after match, Arsenal kept winning, or at least not losing. England's big teams took turns trying to stop them. Manchester United, Chelsea, Liverpool. But Arsenal held firm. And at the heart of that machine, Thierry Henry was the soul. Henry didn't just score goals, he led the team in a way few strikers could. When Arsenal needed a moment of explosion, he appeared. When the game became stuck, he found the space. His bursts of speed forced defenders to drop deeper, creating room for teammates. His cold finishes turned the smallest chances into goals. The crowd at Highbury gradually realized they were witnessing something special. Each passing match felt like a new chapter in a magical story. And when the season ended, Arsenal had achieved what many once thought impossible, winning the Premier League without losing a single match. For Arsenal fans, it was the perfect season, an unbeaten team, a symbol of beautiful football. And at the center of it all, Thierry Henry became the face representing that entire era. His goals were replayed over and over on television. The press hailed him as England's greatest striker. Fans chanted his name in the stands. To the world, Henry, at that moment, seemed to have reached the absolute peak of football. But behind that spotlight was another story, one very few people saw. Because to maintain that greatness, Henry had to live under enormous pressure every single day. When you're the top goal scorer, when you're the face of the unbeaten team, people start expecting miracles from you in every match. If Henry scored, it was normal. If he didn't score, it became a question. Why was Henry quiet today? What happened to him? Those questions didn't just come from the press. They came from fans, from the stands, from the very atmosphere of top-level football. In the locker room, Henry usually tried to keep his familiar calm appearance. He smiled with teammates. He talked to the young players. But inside, the pressure began to build bit by bit, because he knew that if Arsenal wanted to remain England's greatest team, he had to keep scoring, not just sometimes, but constantly, every week, every match. And that was a burden few players could truly understand. There were nights after matches when Highbury had gone quiet and the locker room lights slowly dimmed, when Henry still sat alone. He looked at his boots, at the feet that had run dozens of kilometers during the game. He thought about all the expectations resting on his shoulders. When he was a boy in Les Ulis, he once thought success would bring freedom. That if one day he became a football star, all the pressure would vanish. But now, having achieved what millions of kids dream of, he began to realize a different truth. Success can also become a cage. When you're at the top, people don't want you to step down. They want you to stay there forever. They want you to keep scoring unimaginable goals, to keep being the hero of every match. And if one day you can't do it anymore, the world will start looking for a replacement. Thierry Henry understood that better than anyone. So even when Arsenal became the unbeaten team, even when he was called England's most feared striker, he still didn't allow himself to relax. The training sessions continued. The extra hours on the training ground continued. Because Henry knew that in football, glory doesn't last forever. And deep in his heart, he began to feel something very few fans could understand. To the world, the Invincibles season was the perfect dream. But for Thierry Henry, it was also the moment he realized that sometimes the greatest success comes with the greatest cost. And that cost was the feeling that you could never stop fighting. But in football, even the greatest teams have one dream they crave more than anything. For Arsenal FC, it wasn't the Premier League. It wasn't the FA Cup. It was the biggest trophy in European football. The trophy every player, every club wants to touch at least once in their life. The UEFA Champions League. For many years, Arsenal had tried but always fallen short at the final hurdle. And then, in 2006, that dream seemed closer than ever before. After a tough journey, Arsène Wenger's team reached the final. For Thierry Henry, it wasn't just a match. It was a chance to complete his legacy. He had won the World Cup. He had won the Premier League. He had become Arsenal's icon. But the Champions League, that was the one trophy still missing. That night, at the Stade de France in Paris, the atmosphere felt like a dream. Tens of thousands of Arsenal fans filled the stands with hope that their team would finally reach the European peak, but their opponents were no ordinary team. It was FC Barcelona, one of the strongest clubs in the world. The match began with tension you could feel in every pass. Every touch carried the weight of history. And then the turning point came very early. Arsenal's goalkeeper, Jens Lehmann, was sent off, forcing the English team to play with 10 men for most of the match. For many teams, that would have been the end. But Arsenal didn't collapse. They fought, they defended, and astonishingly, they even took the lead. When Sol Campbell headed the ball into Barcelona's net, the Arsenal stands erupted. In that moment, the dream seemed real. But the match was still long. Barcelona pushed forward, and Arsenal had to defend with everything they had. And then, in a rare moment, an opportunity came for Thierry Henry. A pass opened up space. Henry burst forward, got behind the defense, and faced goalkeeper Victor Valdés one-on-one. It was the moment the entire stadium seemed to hold its breath. For a striker who had once made the whole Premier League tremble, it was a chance he usually didn't miss. But this time, his shot didn't go in. Valdés saved it. The Arsenal stands clutched their heads in regret. Henry turned away, trying to stay calm. The match continued. But then Barcelona equalized. And just minutes later, they scored again. When the final whistle blew, the scoreboard showed what no Arsenal fan wanted to see. Barcelona 2-1. The Champions League dream shattered. In the stands, many Arsenal fans shed tears, but for Thierry Henry, the pain was far deeper. He stood on the pitch for a few seconds, staring toward Barcelona's goal, where just minutes earlier, he had had the chance to change history. In his mind, that moment replayed like slow-motion footage. If that shot had gone in, if he had been calmer, if he had finished earlier, those questions had no answers. But they stayed there. When Henry walked into the locker room after the match, the atmosphere was so heavy that no one spoke a word. The Arsenal players sat in silence. Some bowed their heads. Some stared at the floor. For them, this wasn't just a loss. It was the biggest opportunity many of them would ever have in their careers. Thierry Henry sat down on the bench, took off his boots, and then, for the first time in many years, he could no longer hold his familiar calm. Tears began to fall. Those who were in the locker room later recalled that Henry barely said anything. He just sat there, silent, trying to process what had just happened. To the outside world, it was just a defeat in a final. But for Henry, it was the moment he felt he had let slip away the one thing still missing from his career. He had overcome childhood pressure. He had survived the failure at Juventus. He had become England's most feared striker. But that night, none of it seemed to matter anymore. In the many years that followed, when asked about the 2006 Champions League final, Henry always said it was one of the most painful memories of his career. Not because Arsenal lost, but because he knew he had the chance to change the outcome. And sometimes, in the quiet moments of his later life, the memory of that night still returned. The moment he faced Valdés, the moment he shot the ball, the moment the whole world seemed to pause for one brief second. For Arsenal fans, Thierry Henry remains the greatest legend in the club's history. but for him personally, the 2006 UEFA Champions League final always carries a sense of unfinished business. A trophy he never got to touch, a night he never forgot, and perhaps a wound that time never fully heals. After the painful night of the 2006 UEFA Champions League final, Thierry Henry's life continued moving forward, at least in the eyes of the world. To the fans, he was still Arsenal FC's leader, still the striker every Premier League defense had to watch out for. The goals kept coming. The stands kept chanting his name, and the media still called him one of Europe's greatest players. But behind the spotlight of his career, another part of Henry's life began to crack. And this time, it wasn't a football match. It was his marriage to Claire Mary. Henry met Claire Mary in the late 1990s, when his career was starting to explode in London. Claire was a gentle, reserved English model, completely different from the glamorous world of football. Their relationship developed quickly, and in 2003 they married in a ceremony that drew special attention from the English media. To many fans, their story felt like a perfect chapter in the life of a football star. Henry wasn't just England's greatest striker, he was also a husband and later a father when their daughter was born. In the photos published in the press, Henry always appeared with his familiar calm smile, while Claire stood beside him looking gentle. But those photos didn't tell the whole story. The life of a top-level football player isn't like what many people imagine. Constant travel, long training sessions, intense matches, and non-stop media attention make personal life far more fragile. Thierry Henry wasn't just a husband. He was a captain, an icon, the man millions expected to create miracles every weekend. And that pressure didn't disappear when he left the stadium. It followed him home, followed him into every day of his life. Gradually, distances began to appear. Henry spent most of his time on football. Claire lived in a different world, where the media spotlight never really turned off. Rumors, articles, and speculation about a football star's life started creeping into their marriage. And then, in 2007, while Henry was still at the peak of his career, news that shocked many fans emerged. His marriage to Claire Mary had ended. Their divorce quickly became one of the biggest stories exploited by the English press. Tabloids dug into every detail of the relationship. They wrote about assets, rumors, reasons the public never truly knew. Some articles even tried to turn Henry's personal story into a public drama. For someone who had always kept his private life fairly discreet, the attention felt like a storm. Thierry Henry rarely spoke publicly about that divorce, but those close to him later said it was one of the hardest periods in his life. Because while the world saw him as a football superstar, in his personal life he was going through a deep loss. In the days after the divorce news broke, Henry still had to step onto the pitch. He still had to score. He still had to lead the team. But behind that familiar smile, he began to feel exhausted. Loneliness is something few fans can imagine when looking at a sports superstar's life. They see packed stadiums, hear the praise, see the million-dollar contracts, but they don't see the quiet evenings when a player returns home after a match and realizes his personal life is no longer the same. For Henry, that period felt like a silent battle. He couldn't share everything with the media. He also couldn't let personal issues affect the team. But what probably hurt him most wasn't the end of the marriage itself. It was the way the story was turned into headlines across the papers. The articles, the speculation, and the judgments made Henry feel misunderstood. In the public's eyes, every story gets simplified into short lines. But real life is never that simple. In the years that followed, when looking back on that period, Henry once admitted it was a time that forced him to think deeply about the cost of fame. Because at the peak of football, you're not just playing in front of tens of thousands at the stadium. You're living under the eyes of the entire world, and sometimes the light of fame can make the most important things in life feel fragile. For Thierry Henry, those years were a painful reminder that even legends on the pitch can't control everything in their lives. And while the world continued to praise his goals, in his heart there remained an emptiness no goal could ever fill. After the upheavals in his personal life, Thierry Henry still continued to step onto the pitch with his familiar professionalism. To the football world, he remained one of the greatest strikers of his generation. But in 2009, a moment on the field changed the way the entire world looked at him. Not a beautiful goal, not a trophy, but a controversial moment that put his reputation under the harsh spotlight of the entire football world. It was the World Cup playoff between France and Ireland, the match deciding the final spot at the 2010 World Cup. After the first leg, the two teams entered the second leg in an atmosphere of extreme tension. Millions watched because only one team could advance. As the match moved into the final minutes of extra time, the score still left both teams on the brink of elimination. And then the fateful moment happened. A messy ball in the penalty area. The ball flew toward Thierry Henry. In an instant, he controlled it with his hand, before crossing for teammate William Gallas to score. The goal was allowed. The referee didn't see the handball, and just seconds later, the entire stadium erupted. France took the lead. When the final whistle blew, the French national team officially secured their ticket to the World Cup. Ireland was eliminated. But the joy didn't last long. Just minutes after the match, slow-motion replay started appearing on television screens. The whole world saw what the referee had missed. Thierry Henry had used his hand to control the ball before assisting the goal. Those images spread across international media channels. Irish fans were furious. Sports commentators debated fiercely. Many believed Ireland had been robbed of a fair chance to qualify for the World Cup. And in the eye of that storm of controversy, Thierry Henry's name appeared on every front page. The days that followed became one of the most stressful periods in his career. Henry admitted after the match that the ball had hit his hand. He said it was a reflex in a chaotic moment. But that explanation did little to calm the anger of many fans. In Ireland, supporters felt betrayed. Many called it one of the most controversial moments in modern football history. Across Europe, the media began questioning Henry's sportsmanship. For a player who had spent nearly his entire career building an image as a legend, those criticisms felt like a heavy blow to his reputation. For many years, Henry had been known as one of Europe's most talented and elegant strikers. But in a single night, a portion of the public began looking at him differently. No longer just a World Cup champion, an Arsenal FC icon, but a player tied to a controversial moment. For Henry, it was an indescribable mental burden. He wasn't the first footballer in history to be involved in a controversial situation. But when you're a global star, every mistake gets magnified under the lights of international media. In the days after the match, Henry appeared before the press looking unusually tired. He said Ireland perhaps deserved another chance, even suggesting the match could be replayed. But that never happened. The referee's decision stood, and France kept their World Cup spot. Still, the controversy around that goal never truly faded. Many years later, when people mention Thierry Henry, that moment is still often brought up as an inseparable part of his story. For a player who scored hundreds of stunning goals, it's ironic that one of the most famous images in his career is a controversial handball. For Thierry Henry, it wasn't just an incident on the pitch. It was a moment that made him realize how fragile a legend's reputation can be. In football, glory can be built over hundreds of matches, but sometimes just one moment is enough to change the way the world sees you. And even though Henry continued to play, continued to score, and continued to be respected by many fans, that event left an indelible mark on his career. It didn't destroy Thierry Henry's legacy, but it made his story more complex, a story of glory, pressure, and moments that even legends can't escape from the world's judgment. After the storm of controversy in 2009, Thierry Henry's career continued, but nothing was quite the same as before. His reputation remained huge. The titles still got mentioned, but deep down, Henry began to clearly feel that an important chapter in his life was slowly coming to a close. In fact, that turning point had started earlier, from 2007, when he made the decision to leave the place that had turned him into a legend, Arsenal FC. That decision was far from easy. To Arsenal fans, Henry wasn't just the captain. He was the icon, the all-time top scorer in the club's history. The man who delivered magical moments on the Highbury pitch. But football doesn't always allow a beautiful story to last forever. After so many years at the peak, Henry began to feel his body wasn't as strong as before. Arsenal was also entering a transition phase. And at nearly 30 years old, he understood that if he wanted to conquer the European peak one more time, he might have to step into a new chapter. So in the summer of 2007, Henry moved to FC Barcelona. To many, it was a major deal in European football. Barcelona at the time was building an attacking squad full of talent, and they believed Henry would be the perfect piece. But for Henry himself, the feeling of leaving Arsenal was like an unspeakable farewell. He had spent nearly a decade in London. The goals, the matches, the stands chanting his name, all of it had become part of who he was. When Henry said goodbye to the Arsenal fans, many of them shed tears. And so did he, because he knew he wasn't just leaving a club, he was leaving a home. The early days at Barcelona weren't easy at all. Spanish football was different from the Premier League. The pace of matches was different. The way of moving was different. And Henry, after so many years as the center of Arsenal, now had to learn to adapt to a new system. In that Barcelona squad, there were many big stars. Henry was no longer the only player the whole team revolved around. For some players, that change could make them lose their identity. But Henry tried to adapt. He accepted the new role. He worked hard, just like he had when he was a boy in Les Ulis. And then, after 2 challenging seasons, the reward finally came. The 2008-2009 season became one of the greatest in Barcelona's history. Under Pep Guardiola's leadership, the Spanish team played with an almost perfect style, and in that lineup, Henry played an important role. He scored, assisted, and helped Barcelona conquer every major title. The peak of the season came when Barcelona reached the Champions League final. For Henry, it was a chance to erase the painful memory of the 2006 final. When the final whistle blew, Barcelona became European champions. Finally, Thierry Henry got to touch the Champions League trophy, the title he had once let slip away in Arsenal colours. In the moment of lifting the cup, Henry smiled. It was a relieved smile, like a man who had finally completed what he had pursued for so many years. But even standing among his Barcelona teammates, even celebrating one of the greatest victories of his career, there was still an indescribable feeling in Henry's heart. Because even though Barcelona gave him the Champions League trophy, Thierry Henry's heart had always belonged to London. Arsenal wasn't just where he played football. It was where he grew up, where he went from a doubted player to a legend. The streets around Highbury, the chants from the stands, the years fighting alongside teammates, all of it remained in his memory. And many years later, when speaking about Arsenal, Henry often used one simple but deeply emotional word: home. Perhaps that's what makes Thierry Henry's story so special. Because in modern football, where players often move from club to club, very few have a connection as deep with one team as Henry did with Arsenal. He may have won the Champions League with Barcelona. He may have lifted many other titles in his career. But if you ask Henry where truly defined him and his career, the answer is always the same. Arsenal wasn't just a club. Arsenal was where he became Thierry Henry. But no matter how great a player is, time is ultimately the opponent no one can defeat. After the successful years at FC Barcelona, and after finally touching the Champions League trophy he had craved throughout his career, Thierry Henry began to clearly feel that his body wasn't the same anymore. The speed that once made the entire Premier League tremble no longer exploded like in his early London days. The long strides were still beautiful, but they no longer carried the lightness of youth. And in top-level football, losing even a small part of speed or power changes everything. That was when Henry understood his career was entering its final chapter. In 2010, he made a decision that left many fans feeling bittersweet. Henry left Europe to join New York Red Bulls in Major League Soccer. For many European players, MLS was a place to find a slower pace of life after the intense years in major leagues. But for Henry, it wasn't a vacation. He still wanted to play, still wanted to feel the sensation of stepping onto the pitch, hearing the crowd, and touching the ball. The only difference was that this time, he knew the journey was gradually coming to an end. New York brought Henry a completely different environment. The noisy city, the fast pace of life, the diverse crowd, all of it created a new chapter in his life. American fans quickly welcomed Henry as a true legend. Every time he stepped onto the field in Red Bull's colors, the stands were filled with excitement. For many young American spectators, it was the first time they got to see one of Europe's greatest strikers play in person. And Henry, even past his peak, still showed flashes of genius. The cold finishes, the subtle passes, and sometimes solo runs that made the crowd leap from their seats. But the biggest difference in this period wasn't in the goals. It was in the way Henry looked at himself. For most of his career, he had always been the one running forward, always fighting, always proving, always chasing the next title. But in New York, for the first time in many years, he began to allow himself to look back. He looked back at the path from Les Ulis to Monaco, from Juventus to Arsenal, from the pain of the 2006 Champions League final to the joy of lifting the cup with Barcelona. And he began to understand that every journey, no matter how great, must have an ending. There were MLS matches where Henry stepped onto the pitch and clearly felt his body no longer reacted as quickly as before. There were moments he chased a pass and realized he was a step slower than in his glorious years. For a player who had once lived off speed and goal-scoring instinct, that wasn't easy to accept. But instead of fighting that reality, Henry gradually learned to accept it. Because one of the hardest challenges for any legend isn't winning, it's knowing when to stop. Those final years at New York Red Bulls felt like a long goodbye. Each passing match carried the feeling that the number of times he stepped onto the field was getting fewer. Fans began to notice it. They cheered louder. They took more photos. They knew they were witnessing the final chapters of one of the greatest players of his generation, and Henry knew it too. In 2014, Thierry Henry officially announced his retirement. The decision wasn't surprising, but it still left many feeling empty, because for more than a decade, the name Henry had been tied to the most beautiful goals, the most brilliant moments in European football. When he left the pitch, a part of that era also came to an end. But for Henry, it wasn't the end of football in his life. It was just the end of one role. A legend can leave the field, but the love for the game never disappears. And when he walked off the stadium for the last time as a player, Thierry Henry understood that his next challenge was no longer scoring goals or winning titles. The next challenge was learning to live with the memory of a great career, and accepting that sometimes goodbye is also part of the glory. After announcing his retirement in 2014, many thought Thierry Henry's life would finally become calmer. No more intense morning training sessions. No more pressure to score in front of tens of thousands of spectators. No more matches where the whole world watched his every run. But the truth is, when a player has devoted nearly his entire life to football, the silence after the roar of the stadium can sometimes become a completely different challenge. In the early days after leaving the pitch, Henry began exploring new roles in the football world. He quickly became a familiar face on television, working as an analyst for major sports programs. With the experience of a legend who had conquered many competitions, his insights on tactics and mentality always drew fans' attention. People didn't just listen to him because of his fame, but because of the rare honesty and depth with which he viewed football. When Henry talked about a striker missing a chance, he understood that feeling. When he spoke about the pressure of finals, he had lived through those moments. But Henry didn't want to just stand on the outside and talk about football. He wanted to get closer to the pitch again. So he began the path of coaching. Henry worked on the Belgium national team's coaching staff during their era with a talented generation of players. Later, he tried his hand as head coach at AS Monaco, the place that had once been the starting point of his playing career. It was an emotional, full circle, returning to where he had once been a hopeful boy, but this time as the leader. Coaching isn't easy at all. It's completely different from scoring goals on the pitch. Henry had to learn to face pressure from the media, from the board, and from the expectations placed on a legend. Even though the results weren't always what he hoped for, that experience helped him understand more clearly that football isn't just a game of brilliant moments. It's also work, responsibility, and tough decisions. After Monaco, Henry continued to lead CF Montreal and MLS. In North America, he found an environment different from European football, less media pressure, but still full of tactical challenges and team-building demands. Although he later stepped away from coaching to focus on family and personal projects, Henry remained connected to football in various other ways. He became an ambassador for numerous sports and social organizations, participated in charitable activities, and used his fame to help communities. To fans around the world, Henry is no longer just the former striker of Arsenal FC or Barcelona. He has become a global football icon. But behind those new roles, Henry sometimes speaks about the scars football left behind. In rare personal interviews, he admits that the life of a top player doesn't just bring glory. It also brings pressure, loneliness, and unforgettable memories. The years of playing at intense levels left his body with lingering injuries, but the mental scars are sometimes even deeper. Memories of the 2006 Champions League final, the controversies after the 2009 World Cup playoff, or the breakdown in his personal life all remain parts of the story he can't erase. Thierry Henry once said that football gave him everything: fame, success, opportunities to change his life. But football also took a lot away. It took his youth. It forced him to live under pressure that very few can understand. And sometimes, when standing in front of audiences as an analyst or coach, Henry doesn't just see the players on the field. He sees himself from many years ago, a boy from Les Ulis chasing a ball with the hope that it would open a different path in life. Perhaps that's why Thierry Henry today often speaks about football with more quietness. No longer the pride of a striker who just scored a decisive goal. No longer the cold gaze of a penalty box assassin. Instead, he is a man who fully understands that behind every legend are stories the audience rarely sees. And even though the roar of the stadium has faded into the past, football remains an inseparable part of his life, a part that brings both pride and scars that only he truly understands. And so, when the roar of the stadium has receded into the background, when the boots have been tucked away in a corner of memory, the final question about Thierry Henry's life is no longer about the goals. It's no longer about the titles, the records, or the explosive moments on the pitch. The real question is, what is his legacy? For many years, the world saw Thierry Henry as an almost perfect legend. Fans remember the bursts of speed at Highbury, the cold finishes that left goalkeepers helpless. They remember the Champions League evenings, the goals that shook the stands, the moments when the entire stadium rose when Henry got the ball. To Arsenal FC supporters, he wasn't just the greatest player in the club's history. He was the symbol of an era when football became beautiful, fast, and full of emotion. But if you look deeper into Thierry Henry's story, you'll see that his legacy wasn't written only in goals. It was written in the battles few people saw. He was a child who grew up under pressure. a boy in Les Ulis, where every football training session wasn't just a game, but a test. His father didn't teach him with gentle encouragement. He taught with discipline, with strictness, with a message Henry never forgot. Failure is not an option. For a child, that pressure could break many. But Henry didn't break. He learned to live with it. And gradually, he turned pressure into drive. He was also a man once doubted. When his career nearly collapsed at Juventus, many believed Thierry Henry was just an overhyped talent. Italian media mocked him. Football experts said he wasn't good enough to be a top striker. For many young players, such criticism could destroy confidence. But Henry didn't give up. Thanks to Arsène Wenger's belief, he found a second chance at Arsenal. And from there, he wrote one of the greatest stories in Premier League history. But even after becoming a legend, Henry's life was never a perfect road. There were failures he carried for years. The 2006 UEFA Champions League final remains a painful memory. The missed chance against Barcelona's goal still replays in his mind many years later. For a striker who lived to score, no pain is greater than the feeling that he could have changed history but didn't. And then there were the off-field upheavals. The broken marriage to Claire Mary exposed his personal life under media lights. The controversial moment in the 2009 World Cup playoff sparked worldwide debate about his sportsmanship. Those events reminded everyone that even legends can't control everything in their lives. But what makes Thierry Henry's story special isn't that he avoided failure. It's how he faced it. After the Champions League pain, he kept playing. After the controversies, he kept stepping onto the pitch. After leaving Arsenal, he kept chasing the dream until he finally lifted the Champions League trophy with FC Barcelona. And when his playing career ended, he didn't disappear from football. He became a coach, an analyst, an inspiration for the next generation. Perhaps that's what many don't realize when looking at sports legends. They think greatness comes only from winning moments. But in Thierry Henry's case, greatness also came from endurance, from the ability to carry the enormous expectations of the entire football world on his shoulders and still keep moving forward. Throughout his career, Henry scored hundreds of goals. He won the World Cup, European Championship, Premier League, and Champions League. Those titles will always be part of football history. But if one day someone asks what truly made Thierry Henry a legend, the answer probably lies elsewhere. Not in the trophies he lifted, but in the burdens he carried. Because very few understand that behind every goal, every moment of glory, there were always years of pressure, doubt, and loneliness. Thierry Henry lived through all of it, and he stood firm. That is his true legacy. Some legends are remembered for the trophies they win. Thierry Henry will be remembered not just for the trophies, but for the strength he needed to carry the burden of greatness, without letting it break him. Looking back at Thierry Henry's entire story, it's hard to see him as just a football legend. Behind the image of Arsenal FC's greatest striker ever lies a life full of pressure and wounds few fans truly understand. From his childhood in Les Ulis, with a strict father who always taught that failure is not allowed to exist, Henry grew up in fear of having to prove himself. That fear followed him throughout his career, from the near collapse at Juventus when mocked by the media, to the painful night of the 2006 UEFA Champions League final when he missed the chance to change Arsenal's history. Then the off-field events, the broken marriage to Claire Mary, or the controversial moment in the 2009 World Cup playoff showed that even those praised by the whole world must live under harsh public judgment. Those details make Henry's story not just about football, but about humanity. What deserves respect isn't just that he scored hundreds of goals or won the Champions League with FC Barcelona, but the way he got back up after every mental wound. For American society, where resilience and personal will are highly valued, Henry's story reminds us that true success isn't a life without failure. Success is the ability to keep walking when failure pressure, and loneliness try to pull you down. Henry isn't perfect, but that very imperfection makes him a respected icon, a man who carried the burden of greatness on his shoulders and still continued to live, fight, and inspire the world. If the story of Thierry Henry's resilience and the burdens behind his glory makes you reflect, subscribe to the channel so we can continue telling the real stories of legends the world thinks it already fully understands. Thank you for listening to the end, and see you in the next video, where we'll explore another extraordinary life hidden behind the spotlight of sports.